In the second part, I'm now going to present our next speaker. We finally arrived at the aesthetics part of our workshop. Jonathan Robson is fellow at Nottingham University. His current research focuses primarily on epistemology of aesthetic and more broadly normative judgments, and particularly on the debate over the nature and value of aesthetic testimony. He has also published on a range of other topics, including the philosophy of comics and video games, the evil of death, the relationship of God to possible worlds, and the metaphysics of composition. And I'll give you the word.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about the aesthetic testimony debate, as I do a lot, and thinking about, the relationship between the debate about aesthetic testimony and the debate about moral testimony, particularly in relation to certain kinds of oppression. So hopefully it'll become a bit clearer what that means shortly. So this is kind of something I was working on a little bit a couple of years back, and then kind of got distracted by some other stuff, and I'm just going back to it now. And so quick plan, I'm going to kind of talk just about the debates in general, debate about moral testimony, debate about aesthetic testimony in general. I look a bit at this particular kind of argument that says, well, there's certain particular reason to defer in moral cases to certain members of oppressed groups about kind of facts relating to their oppression. I'll say a bit more about what that means in that section, and then ask, well, if that's right in the moral case, I'm going to assume it's right in the moral case. If it is right there, then does it apply to the aesthetic case as well? Think about a couple of different cases to do with aesthetics, and for each I'm going to suggest no. Okay, so my kind of original conclusion is no. I think it's an area where the kind of moral case and the aesthetic case do seem analogous. There isn't the same kind of argument to be made in the aesthetic case. So kind of handily for me, I think yes is also interesting as an answer. So at the moment the answer is no, but if it turns out I'm wrong, the answer is yes, that's also interesting. So a nice kind of feature there is basically, if I've got objections, I can just change my mind and say the other thing, and that'll work too. It'll be interesting, hopefully, as something to say. Okay, so first off, moral and aesthetic testimony. Again, not sure how many of you are familiar with these debates already, just going to go over them quite quickly. Okay. So aesthetic testimony, so kind of some early quotes here that are often sort of taken to be the origins of these debates, particularly the first one from Kant. So kind of Kant says there that a thing must please others could never serve as the basis for an aesthetical judgment. So the idea is that kind of Kant's view, you can't just defer to the people when making your aesthetic judgments. So even a whole bunch of people might agree that this kind of building, poem, whatever is really amazing. That doesn't work as the basis for your own aesthetic judgment. A couple of other people, a fair bit later on. So again, Kant says some stuff about testimony there, then talks lots about principles of taste. Principles of taste got debated a whole bunch for the next couple of 100 years. So whether we could kind of infer aesthetic properties from other properties of the work, those kind of inferences got talked about a lot. Testimony itself tended to get neglected for quite a while, but then sort of came back a little bit towards the end of the 20th century in kind of Torme there and Walheim, talking about kind of, again, some concerns about testimony in aesthetics. So Walheim's thing at the bottom, that's kind of famously called the acquaintance principle, suggesting that, again, in general, the judgments of aesthetic value must be based on first-hand experience of their objects. So yeah, that kind of, in order to kind of make a judgment aesthetically of a painting, I've got to look at the painting, musical work, I've got to listen to the musical work, etc. So that very general principle is kind of called the acquaintance principle. But part of that, he also explicitly rules out this idea of transmitting knowledge from one person to another. So the acquaintance principle doesn't just rule out testimony, it rules out other things like certain kinds of inference. But certainly among the things it looks to rule out are testimony about aesthetics. So again, kind of, if I look at the painting myself and make a judgment, that's okay. I mean, again, assuming going with my eyesight and everything else, that's okay. But then, kind of, believing the painting is beautiful because you say so, that's not okay in some way. Again, there are debates about exactly what isn't going to be okay there, because, well, if I've got a photograph of the painting or reproduction, is that good enough? That's a whole separate debate, but clearly, the kind of key bit is testimony is definitely going to be a no-no if you accept anything like that principle. And more recently, a couple of quotes there, with people kind of talking about talking about testimony aesthetics. So it's nice we're actually kind of tying into the previous talk on the first one. So kind of Hopkins talks about his view and says, also at least something. So kind of qualifying at the end, but kind of Hopkins is actually one of the people that thinks what he's saying there. So he says, if you tell me that some film you've seen is excellent, it's far from here that I can legitimately adopt your view. Your testimony might motivate me to watch the film, but it does not give me the right to the belief that the film is excellent. I will not have that right until I've seen the film myself. So despite the hedge at the end, that is actually Hopkins' own view, the idea that I don't have in some sense the right to believe or judge that the film is a good film until I've seen it for myself. And again, kind of Hill's some of the thoughts. There's something very peculiar about judging Rembrandt's drawings great, works hard, if you haven't seen them for yourself, or telling people that War and Peace is a masterpiece when you haven't read a single word. So interestingly, there's kind of a shift there from what seems like kind of belief to what seems like assertion in the second part of the example. And that does happen quite a lot, so there's discussions about, as a testimony, particularly some early discussions, tended to talk about belief and talk about assertion and kind of blend them together quite a lot. I mean, Hills doesn't do that, so elsewhere she separates them a lot and talks about them differently. But then, there does be two different cases there. So my own view is that the belief kind of claim is wrong, so the beliefs can be fine, but I agree the assertion is problematic for pragmatic reasons. But anyway, again, just kind of in relation to the previous talk, worth noting the difference there between the belief case and the assertion case. Interestingly, on the assertion case, I think typically saying it's beautiful but I haven't seen it seems implicitous. There's something kind of implicit about it's beautiful but I haven't seen it. But then, different kinds of more complicated sentences seem fine. So they kind of, I think they say it's beautiful but I've not seen it, or so-and-so says it's beautiful but I've not seen it, seems fine. But also things like I'm certain it's beautiful, or I'm sure it's beautiful but I've not seen it, actually seem fine to me as well, so things that might perhaps strengthen it rather than qualifying. But anyway, so that's kind of a separation there. So basically, the current debate, there's like a little sort of plug there, so a bit of a small for bookshops, do buy a copy for your friends and family at Christmas. So there's this kind of debate here between the pessimist and the optimist in aesthetics, and very roughly at least, the pessimist says, we can't legitimately form aesthetic judgments on the basis of testimony, and the optimist says, yes we can. That's the debate. So the kind of pessimist thinks that there's something legitimate, problematic, etc. about forming aesthetic judgments on the basis of testimony, and the optimist denies that. Okay, so that's kind of at least the rough way of setting out. There are some complications there. So lots of pessimists kind of hedge their views in various ways, and pretty much all pessimists do that. So very few, many pessimists think it's literally never ever okay to make any sort of judgment on the basis of testimony. So kind of case they're thinking about something like Cleopatra is beautiful. So Cleopatra is beautiful. I think like that's the kind of thing a lot of people think it's fine to believe that on the basis of testimony for a few reasons. I think sometimes people think that kind of the problem is more about artworks rather than judgments about people's appearance or judgments of natural beauty, things like that. Also, in terms of Cleopatra is beautiful, because there's no other option really, there's no other option, you can't go and see her for yourself. There's no other option than to believe that on the basis of testimony. Okay, so again, various reasons, kind of pessimists think certain cases perhaps it is okay, but at least in general, particularly when it comes to presently existing artworks, there's some kind of big problem with forming aesthetic beliefs on the basis of testimony. Okay, so just kind of quickly thinking about aesthetic judgment, what do we mean there? So I'm going to assume for kind of present purposes that there's a kind of fairly wide notion of aesthetic. So people can use aesthetic in quite different senses. So one sense is kind of very wide, it's pretty much any property that kind of have when evaluating an artwork. So kind of Hopkins talked before about like being a good film or something, and Hills talked about being a great novel. Those things in a kind of wide sense count as aesthetic. Similarly, things like being original counts as aesthetic, things like being amusing counts as aesthetic in this wider sense. There's like a narrower sense of aesthetic linked very close to perception. So it talks about things like kind of being graceful, gaudy, beautiful, ugly, etc. as being aesthetic. Whereas other properties like being a good film wouldn't be aesthetic in that narrow sense. For present purposes, I need to be kind of quite wide. I'll hopefully see why later, because I'm talking about quite a wide range of properties. So again, making aesthetic quite widely, just think about pretty much any property that's kind of used to evaluate an artwork as an artwork. So properties evaluate artwork as an artwork, not as an investment or as whatever else. Those are going to be the aesthetic properties. That's at least roughly the thought. And judgments. So judgment here means something like the kind of mental correlate of aesthetic assertions, or at least kind of sincere paradigmatic aesthetic assertions. So that's kind of often used as a neutral term in the current debate. And the thought is, well, people have different views about what that thing is, but like, whatever's kind of the thing going on in my head when I say the Mona Lisa is beautiful or whatever else, that kind of thing is the judgment. Okay. So I'm often going to talk as if it's a belief for the purpose of this paper. So I'm going to often talk about beliefs and judgments interchangeably. But yeah, if you don't think aesthetic judgments are beliefs, that's fine. Just kind of fill in whatever you think they are in place of beliefs. Okay, and then different kinds of pessimism. This is just worth noting as a bit of background. So there are different kinds of pessimists. So the first kind is the most straightforward. That's what kind of Hopkins calls unavailability pessimism. And that just says, well, I can't know that aesthetic claims are true on the basis of testimony. Okay, so the reason why my aesthetic judgments are legitimate when formed on the basis of testimony is quite straightforward because I don't know that. Okay, so whereas like in most cases I can know a bunch of stuff on the basis of testimony, on the basis of people saying things about history, geography, their personal lives, whatever else. Lots of stuff I can learn on the basis of testimony, come to know on the basis of testimony. The unavailability pessimist thinks that aesthetics is an exception here. So for whatever reason, I can't come to know that Mona Lisa is beautiful on the basis of your testimony that it is. So that's an availability view. Again, that sort of view I think isn't particularly popular these days. It still has some defenders, but isn't particularly popular because I think there's generally concern about why is it you can't know that? And particularly, why is it you can't know that doesn't also apply to first-hand judgment? Okay, so typically the pessimist is going to make a contrast between two things. On the one hand, like forming judgments on a basis of testimony and forming them first-hand. And on the other hand, like aesthetic judgments and regular everyday kinds of judgment. And it looks like there's certain arguments about kind of aesthetic testimony you might kind of use, like, well, there's problem about disagreement in aesthetics, or problem about unreliability, etc. in aesthetics. And that kind of stuff might undermine testimony in various ways, but it also seems to undermine kind of first-hand judgment as well. Okay, so again, kind of if the fact that people are unreliable when it comes to aesthetics means I can't take your word for it about something being beautiful, then why think my own first-hand judgment is going to do the job, given the same reason to apply there? So a lot of people now don't take that kind of view and think, well, actually, it's not that kind of I can't know, it's some kind of non-epistemic norm that makes that kind of knowledge kind of bad to have. So that's the unusability view that says there's some kind of non-epistemic norm or norms involved that makes it kind of illegitimate to believe these things on the basis of testimony. So even though that belief might well count as knowledge, there's some kind of further norm that means it's kind of impermissible. So for example, some people suggest like an understanding norm and say, well, when it comes to aesthetics, I have to kind of understand that P in order to believe the P. So whereas like the normal, regular norm is, say, a knowledge norm, in aesthetics there's some kind of further norm, like an understanding norm, that is more demanding. And that is, for example, one reason why some people do think judgment in aesthetics isn't belief. They think that practically different because they think, well, if belief is normed by knowledge, and aesthetic judgment isn't normed by knowledge, it's normed by understanding, then perhaps you should think about aesthetic judgment as being something else rather than being belief. Anyway, then final kind of pessimism is what's meant, well, what I call constitutive pessimism, and that's the idea, well, actually, it's not really it's illegitimate to form aesthetic judgments on the basis of testimony. It's that, like, in some sense, you literally can't. So aesthetic judgment is a certain kind of state that you can only be in if you can experience a thing for yourself. Yeah. Again, there's different versions of that view. And again, kind of, I think some people think, for example, that's what Kant thought. Kant thought, well, aesthetic judgment is a certain kind of experience, a certain kind of pleasurable relation to an artwork, and you just kind of can't have that without seeing the work yourself. You can't have that on the basis of testimony. So it's not that it's kind of wrong or legitimate. It's just that, like, it's not the kind of state you can have in the absence of experiencing the object for yourself. That's kind of a quick overview of different kinds of pessimism there. And then moral testimony. So moral testimony is kind of often taken to be kind of quite closely parallel to aesthetic testimony. So again, pessimists who are wrong in both cases. In both cases, think you can't legitimately form those judgments. Optimists who are awesome think you can. I mean, I think it's kind of a mistake because Rob Hopkins was pessimist in positions. But like my position sounds way cooler. Like optimism, yay! That sounds like way cooler than being a pessimist. We get a nice, friendly sounding view. He gets the nasty, sad sounding view. But yeah, so both cases, kind of optimists and pessimists often say very similar things in the two cases. And typically, if someone's a moral pessimist, they're going to be an aesthetic pessimist. If they're going to be a moral optimist, they're going to be an aesthetic optimist. I mean, I'm not sure I don't know of any exceptions there. There might be some, but as far as I know, like anyone I can think of tends to have the same view in both cases. But despite the fact that they're taken to be very strongly linked, so again, kind of those who claim that you can't form aesthetic judgments on the basis of testimony will often say something very similar about moral judgments. So, for example, in the understanding view, it's quite common for people like Hills, who writes on both cases, to think, well, in both cases the problem. In both cases, the problem is a lack of understanding. That's what means it's problematic to form those judgments on the basis of testimony. But there do seem to be kind of some interesting disanalogies here. Okay, so acquaintance doesn't seem a plausible requirement for moral judgment. So some debate about how to interpret acquaintance here. Some more kind of modern reinterpretations might be plausible, but at least a kind of standard account of acquaintance seems kind of some people quite plausible as a rule for aesthetic judgment. Seems like to pretty much everyone a bad way to judge things morally. So think about, if I've not seen the painting for myself, some people think I can't make a judgment of it aesthetically. If I've not met someone for myself, it seems wrong to think I can't judge them morally. It's like you tell me about some like horrific serial killer, like, well, I've never met the guy, he could be lovely, I can't say. That just seems kind of straightforwardly implausible. Also, I think sometimes people like kind of Hills, who generally more pessimists, will allow for like certain exceptions when it comes to things being kind of urgent, really kind of dramatic cases. So if I need to make some life-changing decision, like right now, or people are going to die, then in that kind of case I can defer, given that super important. I've got time to make my mind up, I've got time for my own research, etc. So like Hills will say, look, in the moral case, it could well be kind of fine to defer there because of the urgency. But that kind of life or death urgency very rarely arises in aesthetic cases. Okay, so kind of typically, like, I don't know whether the film's good or bad. Like, nothing super bad's going to happen if I'm wrong there. Okay, so like, I might waste an afternoon seeing a terrible film, but like, no one's going to die. There's no kind of big urgency there. Okay. And today we look at one other possible difference. So one other case where I think there's some claims that are quite widely made about moral testimony. I think are hard to apply in the case of aesthetic testimony. Okay. And the cases concern kind of a certain kind of deference. So we said kind of in both cases, pessimists typically allow exceptions to the pessimism. They sort of say, well, look, you can't form aesthetic or you can't form moral judgments on the basis of testimony. And then say, well, look, in these cases you kind of can. So, like, I don't mean like literally you never can. Sometimes it's okay. Here are kind of exception cases. And it's one quite common kind of exception in the moral case. So this kind of case from Jones, I think other people there take quite similar views. And Shock's about a case here where you've got someone kind of Peter, and Peter is kind of not a fan of racism, sexism, etc. Okay, you can kind of pick up on fairly kind of obvious, egregious, kind of straightforward, blatant examples of both. But there's various kind of subtle things that Peter just can't pick up on. Okay, so kind of Peter's a white guy who kind of, for whatever reason, can't pick up on particularly subtle, like non-obvious forms of sexism, racism, etc. Okay. So again, the thought there is that kind of Peter's kind of being told by some women that some experiences are kind of clearly sexist. So the thought is kind of various women who know, like whoever, have reported that this person's kind of acting sort of sexist, this person's sexist in various ways, and kind of Peter's not picking up on this. But like kind of, pretty much all the women who are around this guy or whatever else, clearly kind of say, look, this guy's being very sexist, we're all picking up on this, we're all kind of getting this kind of vibe from him. But Peter's not kind of able to kind of get that, he's not able to understand himself. Lots of people who are kind of generally quite pessimistic about moral testimony. I don't think in that kind of case, it might be okay for Peter to defer. Okay, so kind of given that like various people who are kind of used to kind of experiencing sexism have like lifelong experience of various kinds of sexism, given that they're kind of picking up on like, sexism from this person, if Peter, as a person without like his own experience of sexism himself, can't pick up on that, he should defer to these people rather than trying to kind of wait to experience himself. So even if Peter can't himself pick up what sexism involved is, the thought is he should defer in cases like this. Okay. So what do we mean by cases like this? Well, there are a few different ways you might sort of spell out the case of why Peter can't pick up on certain kinds of sexism, or again, certain kinds of racism, or certain kinds of whatever. So the first case is kind of a fairly uninteresting one, where it might just be, well, kind of Peter doesn't know much about sexism or racism in a way that's really easily kind of fixed. Okay, so there's lots of things where perhaps Peter doesn't know lots of slurs, he's kind of a nice kind of like cozy upbringing, hasn't been taught lots of slurs, doesn't know various words of slurs, or there's various bits of kind of racist code that Peter doesn't know. So lots of kind of like far-right groups in the UK, I don't know if that's the thing here, but lots of far-right groups in the UK will kind of sort of graffiti the number 18 around places, okay, and then kind of again, because that's like 18 being like A and H in the alphabet out of Hitler's initials. And again, like that's kind of something crazy to me, not to know what significance that is. So again, it's like Peter just didn't know that stuff. Those gaps are very easily filled in. Okay, so it's just kind of particular facts that Peter doesn't know, explains why things are sexist, racist, etc. That Peter can just straightforwardly learn. That case seems very easy. A second case is a bit trickier where I thought as well, kind of, there's some kind of like, big ignorance on kind of Peter's part again, but that's more kind of deeply embedded, deeply ingrained kind of ignorance that isn't just kind of fixed by saying, well, here's like a list of slurs, or here's a list of kind of coded ways of being kind of racist, sexist, etc. That the kind of knowledge that lets people know what these things being sexist or racist kind of depends on like decades and decades of life experience of people being sexist or racist towards them, that Peter can't just kind of get by reading like a short like 3-page kind of summary or something. It seems like, well, perhaps he can't get that at all without having that own life experience. If he can, it requires like lots and lots of listening to people over time, lots and lots of like watching films and reading kind of novels, whatever else, to get the experience of those people who have that kind of experience. So again, perhaps he can't get it at all, given that's not his life, or if he can, it's going to require an awful lot of imaginative exercise, imaginative work over a lot of time. Version 3, thinking about cases kind of like version 2, so might say, well, Peter has extra reason to defer because he's got this kind of ignorance that isn't easily got rid of. It's not something he can just get to a place himself where he can make those judgments. But version 3 says, well, not just that, but also some extra moral reason for Peter to defer. Okay, so given that these kind of people that Peter's dealing with have been subject to kind of various kinds of oppression in their life that Peter has never experienced, there's kind of some kind of extra moral reason for Peter to defer, kind of based on the fact that kind of that, well, something. Yeah, so what that something is an area for debate, but the thought is there's some extra moral reason, so it's not just that Peter should defer because he's kind of a lot more ignorant about this area than other people involved. Because this area involves a certain kind of oppression and deference to oppressed people, there's some extra moral reason as well for Peter to defer. Okay, so we often have his kind of some plausible claims about moral deference. We often have extra reason to defer in case our own ability to investigate the matter is relatively poor. So that's like a general claim about testimony that I think a lot of people think, well, I should be kind of even more willing to defer when my own ability to investigate is pretty much. So if there's an area I don't know much about, I'm probably kind of much better placed deferring there than when I know a lot about an area. And in particular, when it comes to kind of moral cases, that applies as well. So even a lot of pessimists about moral testimony will think that certain kinds of cases we ought to defer based on just like general ignorance, or based on certain kinds of ignorance. So pretty much everyone thinks that like 3-year-olds ought to defer. Okay, we should just let 3-year-olds make their own like moral life decisions because of the lack of like life experience, lack of knowledge, etc. So again, those are things that most of us shouldn't defer about moral matters. Happy for 3-year-olds to do that in most cases. Similarly, this kind of case Robson Hills talks about someone who doesn't understand why murdering is bad. Okay, they kind of go to their rabbi, and the rabbi says, well, no, like murdering Tim is bad. You shouldn't murder Tim. Okay, I won't murder Tim. What about Tom? Should I murder Tom? No, you shouldn't murder Tom. Tom, Then again, they can't kind of pick up the common factor. They keep having to each person. Well, is murdering that person okay? I don't know. Well, they have a different shirt on. Is that the difference? They're kind of slightly taller. What's the difference here? They don't know. So Hill sort of says there's something going wrong with that person. That seems right. But I think a lot of people think, well, actually, that person really ought to defer. Given how bad they seem to be moral reasoning themselves, we want that person to defer. So Hill thinks that person ought to try and develop their own moral reasoning and do their own kind of moral stuff themselves. A lot of people think, well, actually, probably no. I mean, that person just seems really bad at doing moral reasoning. We don't want the moral reasoning themselves. We want them deferring because their own moral reasoning seems to go so badly. So again, those kind of cases where people have got this kind of pervasive moral ignorance. A lot of people think, even again, people are quite pessimistic elsewhere, we want them to defer, morally speaking. Here's a more controversial claim though. Well, there are specific moral reasons to defer to certain kinds of moral testimony. Okay. So again, the kind of case we're thinking about here to do with kind of Peter and deference about sexism, or kind of, again, people deferring to claims about racism and people of colour. The thought is there's some particularly moral reasons to defer to those kind of things. Again, there's a whole separate debate there about, well, can there be non-epistemic reasons to kind of form beliefs or judgments? That's a whole big debate. We're going to talk about that a bit later on, but worth noting that here. So it does look like there's some suggestion here that there's some reason to kind of form those beliefs on the basis of deference isn't purely epistemic. Okay. Also interestingly, there's been some suggestion that there are actually kind of moral reasons not to defer in certain cases. So Duval suggested here that, again, so certain people are kind of normally kind of privileged, used to be treated as authorities for kind of bad sociological reasons, and perhaps there's extra reasons not to defer to those people, given that kind of they've been given too much credibility or given too much kind of weight to their words by certain unjust social relationships. That's you. So that's something I'm going to skip over. Okay, so what about aesthetics though? So that's kind of quite a lot of claims about the moral case. I'm not going to try and defend any of those moral claims. I mean, I can find them that somewhat convincing, but hey, I'm an optimist anyway. I think it's fine to defer to moral testimony all over the place, so I'm not going to be worried about deferring in those cases. But let's assume we agree about the moral case. And again, even lots of pessimists do. So even lots of people who are generally pessimistic will allow for those kinds of exceptions, and think there can be particular moral reasons to defer. So I mentioned this idea about non-epistemic reasons, and that's a very common thing for pessimists to have anyway. So lots of pessimists think there are non-epistemic reasons not to defer in kind of moral case, and they make a difference. So they're really committed to allowing non-epistemic reasons for belief or not belief. So even again, we've got the pessimists will allow the kind of claims we talked about on the last few slides. And a key claim we're going to look at today as well is an aesthetic analogue here. Does anything similar arise in the aesthetic case? And I'm going to think here as an example of the film Green Book. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the film. Yes. Handily, I'm not actually. It's for example to use my testimony because I've not seen the film myself deliberately. So I deliberately avoided seeing the film myself, so I can talk about like the testimony around the film without having my own actual view coming in. Because again, when I sort of started using examples a few years back, I thought, should I watch the film myself? And I thought, actually, no. I think it's actually works better to talk about testimony if I haven't. But anyway, so you've got the kind of case where it's a biopic about an American jazz singer, early performer, and his driver, and it's kind of like a heartwarming story where the driver like starts out as a kind of racist guy, but then kind of after befriending this black musician, he ends up not being kind of, well, at least as racist anymore, and it's all kind of nice and heartwarming, and won awards. And again, it's lots of kind of praise, lots by various people, but there's kind of quite a lot of people of colour in the US who kind of really like the film. We thought the film was like subtly racist in various ways, actually not subtly racist in various ways, because it kind of like sort of treated the experience of oppression of black people in the US as like a learning opportunity for working class white dudes. So the kind of idea is, well, the whole kind of narrative is about like, hey, kind of racism taught that dude a lesson, and he learned important things about life by racism. So kind of the experience of people of colour in the US is sort of treated as like a backdrop for the kind of like white hero character to learn important life lessons, rather than things that mattered for their own sake. So again, it looks like a case there where, again, lots of kind of white people, including again lots of kind of very well-meaning, kind of anti-racist, liberal white people kind of thought the film was kind of great, thought it was kind of excellent, kind of good moral message. But lots of people of colour kind of criticised it for actually being kind of racist, given the way it presented these kind of tropes. Okay, so thinking about kind of cases of testimony when people have certain kinds of ignorance, and again, you might think the same kind of things can happen in the aesthetic case. Okay, so look, you can have cases where I just happen not to know some stuff. That's why I should defer to people about aesthetics. So I think about a case where you've got some art form that I don't know about. So you say, hey, look, here's some Portuguese art form kept secret from everyone else. Have a look, John. And I have no idea what's going on in this secret Portuguese art form. So because I don't know anything about it, I should just defer like crazy because hey, it's something that's completely outside my area of expertise. That's again things I think lots of kind of pessimists even would say that kind of thing is okay. Or again think about a more deeply embedded kind of case where it requires lots of experience perhaps that I don't have, or perhaps that I kind of can't have. So I had a friend, for example, who didn't find comedy funny. Okay, so she literally found no comedy funny at all. It was a weird kind of thing. So again, it feels like, well, she just kind of can't get comedy. There's something about her as a person that means she can't really assess comedy properly because she finds no comedy funny. So in that kind of case, it looks like, well, if she's going to form any beliefs about what's good and bad as comedy, she has to defer rather than using her own judgment. But then, a kind of third kind of case, again, I'm going to think about today in relation to this example, is can there be some extra kind of moral or aesthetic reason to defer to the testimony of others? So the case like Green Book, for example, we've got people of colour testifying and saying, well, hey, look, actually it turns out this film is kind of racist in various ways. Then, again, certainly you might think, well, look, they've got some kind of experience that makes them kind of, maybe know more about this area than we do. That might be a reason to defer. But is there particularly some kind of moral or perhaps aesthetic reason to defer in addition to normal epistemic ones? And I think it's kind of hard to spell out how that would be. So think about these kind of cases again. For each case, assume the following things hold. So the claim in question is made by members of a relevant press group. So in this case, think about people of colour in the US with relevant expertise based on lived experience. Okay, so talking about certain kind of oppression, sexism, racism, etc. They've got lots of personal experience of other people might lack. And let's assume the claims are true and otherwise meet all relevant standards for deferring testimony in mundane cases. Okay, so thinking about kind of a pessimist, should the pessimist make an exception here? So the pessimist is normally going to say, well, look, even if all the normal conditions for testimonial deference are met, there's something special about the aesthetic case that means we shouldn't defer. Okay, so as I said, most pessimists aren't kind of unavailability pessimists. They don't think there's some kind of straightforward epistemic flaw with deferring to testimony. I think there's an extra requirement to defer to testimony in aesthetics that normally isn't met. And the question is kind of, well, should they make an exception in these cases? Is there some kind of moral or aesthetic reason to make an exception for cases like this? So again, assume the claims are true, assume that they kind of meet all the normal standards we would do to have testimonial knowledge in regular cases. Should the pessimist about aesthetic testimony make an exception in this case as well? And I think it's hard to think, well, what exactly they should take it to be okay to defer to. So here's kind of one thought. Well, take the claim, Green Book fails to capture the lived experience of people of colour in the US. So I think they should defer to that claim. So I think that the aesthetic testimony kind of pessimist should allow, it's fine to defer to that claim. Okay, so people of colour in the US, let's imagine unanimously, obviously in real life it's not unanimously, but let's imagine unanimously agree it doesn't capture their lived experience. Is that something we defer to? I think the pessimist should just say, yes, that's fine. Okay, so that's a fine thing to kind of defer to, because that's not by itself an aesthetic claim. Okay, that's not by itself an aesthetic claim, so you can be happy just to defer to that, and that's fine. Of course, it makes a difference to assessing the film aesthetically, at least kind of broadly speaking. When we think about aesthetic, just anything with the film being good or bad. It makes a difference there. But again, I think the kind of pessimist isn't going to say that you never defer to things that make a difference to how good or bad a film is. That would be kind of implausible. Because again, think about lots of historical films. Lots of historical films are probably made worse if they're historically inaccurate in various ways. But then clearly we can defer by historical facts. So again, if it turns out, well, look, here's a film about the Second World War that kind of features people using the internet. That's kind of really fair in that respect to be an accurate film about the Second World War. That's something, again, we can just defer about quite easily. So it feels like, just the fact that, there's some feature of film that might make it a worse film, doesn't mean we can't defer about that particular feature. That would seem an implausible claim. Okay, so straightforward kind of other end then. Green Book is about film. So could we defer to that? People of colour in the US just say, Green Book is about film. Should we defer to that? I think there's a kind of problematic dilemma here. So on the one hand, if they just sort of say that and say nothing more, then it would seem kind of strange for pessimists to think it's okay to defer, because they haven't appealed to anything there like kind of racism or experience of oppression or anything like that. They've just sort of said it's a bad film and not said why. On the other hand, kind of once they start giving reasons and start saying why it's a bad film, then it's not clear that's really deference anymore. Okay, so once they start giving reasons, we're not straightforward in deferring to testimony now, we're kind of deferring to a bunch of stuff that's said, reasons they've given, rather than just deferring to testimony. Okay, so here's kind of another thing. Well, Green Book is kind of racist, or Green Book is not obviously racist. Green Book is racist in some very subtle ways. I think that's kind of closest to a lot of the examples used in the moral case. So we're kind of deferring about something being racist or being sexist, and that's kind of quite close to what happens in lots of the moral cases. But it's kind of worrying there because, as people like Jones said, I think racist is kind of plausibly a thick moral term. So to say something's racist seems like by itself make a moral judgment about it, but it doesn't seem to be kind of that it's like a thick aesthetic term, I think. And again, you might disagree, I'm not sure. So you might perhaps think it's plausibly always in saying negative. I feel like kind of racist seems like a kind of moral term in a way it doesn't seem like an aesthetic term. I'm not sure kind of if you agree with it or not. That's at least initial intuition. And it's also kind of plausibly a film being racist is further from entailing an overall verdict than in the moral case. So if I tell you that something someone did is racist, then that's almost always at least going to mean that thing's bad. It's like, perhaps it's like an undercover reporter trying to infiltrate a white supremacist group, then they kind of act racistly for good reasons or something, but almost all the kind of cases, if someone acts racistly, I'd say that act in particular is a bad action, morally speaking, and condemning it. Whereas it looks like lots of artworks you can say are kind of racist, but still kind of think actually overall are a good artwork. So lots of people, again, some people have kind of different interpretations and try and argue against this, but most interpretations of Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice is wild anti-Semitic as a play. Lots of people agree with that and say, look, it's anti-Semitic. Merchant of Venice is a play, but still think it's a very good play. So I think that, kind of again, just sort of saying something's kind of racist, less clearly entails kind of bad artwork, than it would entail bad action. Okay. So others, again, we're very happy to try and suggest some other things you might try and think about deferring to in those kind of cases. But these examples that I've kind of thought of there, I think it's harder to see a sort of straightforward case where there's kind of moral reasons or aesthetic reasons to defer to something that the pessimist wouldn't normally allow deference to. Yeah, so it's something like, hey, this doesn't capture lived experience. The pessimist can say, yes, sure, defer to that, that's not an exception to my normal view. Something like it's about film just by itself, and the pessimist can say, well, look, I think we shouldn't defer to that just for the same reasons that we shouldn't defer normally, because they've given no reason, they've given no kind of explanation for why it's a bad film. So interim summary is, well, hey, look, it looks like there is a difference between these two cases. So it's kind of, at least what a lot of people take a plausible exception in the moral case, doesn't seem so plausible as an exception in the aesthetic case. So just quickly to finish, I'm going to think about a different case. This was something suggested by Rebecca Walbang. We talked about this kind of a couple of years back, I was thinking about this before. So here's kind of famous, annoying quote from Kant. So Kant, really not a fan of the Maoris and their tattoos, thinks that there's something just kind of really bad about this tattooing. So again, it's this kind of practice. If there's anything other than human beings, it might be kind of nice, it might be pleasing, it might be good. But there's something kind of bad about this because it's on human beings. So Kant's kind of really kind of negative, really kind of nasty and horrible about the Maori kind of tattooing practices. I think this is clearly a bad thing. And we might think, well, look, Think about the kind of Maoris and their own view of their tattoos and being a kind of important practice and different views of which ones are good and bad and why. We might think, well, actually, there's kind of lots of good reasons to defer to the Maori, not Kant. So, like, deferring to the Maori here seems like a good idea. So, if I'm talking to, like, some Maori people and say, hey, look, these are kind of our best tattoos, these are the most beautiful, most whatever else tattoos that we have, then it seems like good reasons to defer to them about that. Okay. So, one obvious thought is that kind of, well, the Maori knows a lot more than you. Okay, so I assume, like, most of us are experts on Maori tattoos. So if we're talking to like a Maori person who's themselves kind of very experienced in this kind of art form, it seems likely to know a lot more than us. Okay. But of course, the pessimist probably can't like necessarily appeal to that because typically the pessimist will say we can't like just defer to experts. So even if I'm not an expert on kind of painting or music, whatever else, I can't just defer to experts because I'm not an expert. Normally the pessimist would say, no, even in the case of the expert, I shouldn't defer, I should form judgment myself. Another reason is perhaps it kind of respects the unduly neglected and denigrate experience of indigenous peoples. So kind of again, you've got people like Kant for like years and years sort of saying, hey look, this stuff's rubbish, don't listen to these people, they don't know what they're talking about, they're not properly kind of aesthetically developed, whatever else. And again, Kant seems to like address these historical practices. So in some ways you've got this kind of like unjust historical practice of people like Kant and others kind of, again, kind of denigrating these practices, saying they're not valuable, saying they're kind of not deserving of our attention. Again, not listening to Maori voices, not listening to indigenous people themselves, just kind of saying, hey look, here are standards, don't meet them, therefore your stuff is bad. So lots of stuff there about addressing historical injustice might seem like a reason to defer in those cases. And so again, think about parallel to this kind of case by T. Wen. So T. Wen talks about a case where some kind of the child wants to like learn about rap music. They don't know whether rap music is good or not. They don't know whether it's valuable to learn about rap music. Check with a friend Roger, who's a music professor. Roger says, yeah, there's loads of kind of really good rap music, it can be really valuable and important, interesting. Therefore, like, they pay some money to have their child go to rap academy and learn about rap. So the thought there is, well, there's some kind of case there that seems kind of similar, some ways it seems different. So, again, so like in some respects it seems quite similar, so it involves kind of like deferring to someone about an art form you don't know much about yourself, whether it's valuable, whether it's worth studying. Similarly, kind of Maoris might think, well, one reason to defer to Maori people is just because we don't know about the art form ourselves. And perhaps if our kind of ignorance is pervasive enough, deep enough, then perhaps even pessimists might make some kind of exception to the normal thoughts. But also there seems to be some thought about trying to kind of defer to, again, kind of press people that doesn't necessarily come up in Wen's case. Because again, Wen doesn't tell us anything about Roger, we don't know whether Roger's like black, white, etc. So certainly rap music has been kind of dismissed a lot by like very conservative white people particularly. But again, we don't know whether Roger's own positionality, Roger's own lived experience, etc. Okay, so one concern again is like how far things generalise here. So certainly, again, the pessimist isn't going to say any case where someone knows more about you than more than you about some art form, you should defer. That's going to be rejecting pessimism wholesalely. Second, you might think, well, even if we do defer here, it doesn't require a non-epistemic reason. So in fact, you just defer because Maori knows a lot more than us, in the same way Roger knows a lot more about us than rap. So in fact, just deferring because they know a lot more. There's nothing specially interesting happening here. Okay. Or another objection in a different direction is, well, perhaps it does seem to require some kind of extra non-epistemic reason, and that by itself might seem bad or strange. So what is the extra reason here? So, again, as I talked about before, I think some people are quite suspicious about non-epistemic reasons to believe in general. Though again, perhaps, because given we accept those in the moral case, perhaps you have to accept them in the aesthetic case as well. Also worth noting that typically pessimists will already postulate some kind of non-epistemic reasons for belief. So again, that's something that, in sort of standard debate, the opposite is like, hey, look, you have the standard normal reasons, that's why testimony is okay. And the pessimist says, well, no, there's some extra different reasons, that's why testimony is not okay. And this kind of seems quite reversal here, where the kind of optimist is appealing for extra reasons to say it's okay to defer here, the pessimist denying that. Okay. So again, these cases are kind of ones I've come back to quite recently, haven't thought about properly. So I think on those cases, kind of more research is needed. Not quite sure what to say about those. myself. Interested to know what any of you folks think. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks.
Okay, so I have started. I was thinking, sometimes the question about having first-hand experience.
Yes.
Sometimes we do experience the work ourselves.
Yes.
But it's quite common because I see a movie. Let's take an example. Man with the movie camera by Einstein. Right? And on first impression, I see the movie as lacking unity or unstructured.
Yes.
But upon hearing your opinion or something,
Yes.
I come to see it as highly unified and highly structured. So now imagine someone who has read the comments or listened to the comments, and he has a fairly good idea of how the movie may be highly unified and structured. Who has a better epistemic standing here? Does this put some interesting pressure on the acquaintance principle? Would Sosa's notion of first-hand understanding play a role here? To qualify or modify the acquaintance principle?
Yes. Good. So I think, it's interesting because this idea about being based on first-hand experience, there's often debates about what exactly that would amount to in these kind of cases. I think typically people like the pessimist are going to be happy with a case where, if you sort of say, hey, look, this seems a complete mess to me, it's all kind of ununified, and I say, well, look at this bit, this bit, this bit, that makes it nice and unified, and you go, oh yes, I see it now. I think the pessimist would be fine with that. So like, if I'm kind of guiding your own kind of experience, guiding your own kind of vision or something, I think typically the pessimist would be fine with that. So as long as like you yourself do see it on the basis of stuff I say, I think the pessimist would be fine with that. I think, the kind of case where you've sort of seen the film yourself, and then I say, well, actually, no, it's really unified. You just go like, oh, okay, then, and you don't know why. Still, the pessimist is going to think, well, that case is kind of a bad case. So what was the contrast you're drawing there? Sorry, remind me of the two cases. There was. So what the two cases you're talking about before? Sorry,
Sorry, the specific case.
Yes.
The Einstein movie.
Yes.
The man with the movie camera.
Oh yeah. Good. So kind of that. Again, kind of, if it's the case where look, you're deferring to like some expert about the film being unified or something and can't see yourself.
Like you read Carroll's paper on it, for instance.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So I think the thought there is again, if you're reading Carroll's paper and sort of think, well, Carroll knows what he's doing, I'm going to take his word for it. The pessimist is going to think that's wrong. If you're reading Carroll's paper, like, oh, actually, no, I see that now. I see kind of that bit and that bit that kind of fit in well together. So I think that's something where. So even if you see the film for yourself, because completely don't get it after reading Carroll's paper, the pessimist is going to say, well, no, even then you shouldn't just defer. You have to actually base it on your first-hand experience. So if you now kind of like reflect back on your first-hand experience and think, well, actually, no, I was wrong because now I see this kind of tied in really nicely, I think the pessimist will be fine with that. But I think even if you've seen the film for yourself, it wouldn't be fine with them just saying, oh, well, I was wrong and it turned out it's unified. I don't really see why, I don't understand why it's unified. Carroll's a smart guy, I'm sure he's right. They wouldn't be kind of happy with that.
Sometimes even the experts, supposedly you could say he knows what he's doing.
Yes.
Think of cases like the Van Meegeren.
Yes.
I mean, it took a lot of time. Nowadays, any non-expert can look at the Van Meegeren.
Yes.
It's ludicrous.
Yes.
But it took a long time for even the expert.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Those who would normally defer to. Mario.
Thanks. I enjoy this very much, and I don't have strong intuitions with this kind of things, but I just have a question for clarification about the way in which pessimism is usually formulated. So it's not clear to me whether pessimism is a thesis about aesthetic or moral knowledge, or more about something like understanding of these two domains, because it seems to me that I can get like a lot of aesthetic knowledge in virtue of like perfectly reasonable deference. Like it seems perfectly fine to say that I know that a film is good, even if I haven't watched it, to the extent that there is some kind of consensus or critical consensus on it. Or it seems also fine to say that I know that Work is very good, even though I never read it, but I can sort of claim knowledge because there is sort of lots of things that have been said about why it's good and so on and so forth. What I lack maybe is understanding of why it's good. That I will need to watch the film, I will need to read the book. But I guess my worry is that these are sort of pessimist views, they face the burden of like explaining a lot of otherwise looming skepticism about this kind of domains, because a lot of this kind of knowledge seems to come from perfectly reasonable reference. And I was wondering whether these people are aware that we seem to get very strong skeptical conclusions if we stick to this kind of views.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. That's one of the reasons why I'm not very keen on pessimism, because I think it is kind of hard. I think as with lots of things, like lots of aesthetic knowledge is relied on other people in lots and lots of ways that we're not fully aware of. So I think in aesthetics as elsewhere, I think we overestimate how much we kind of form our own beliefs without relying on other people. And I think that when it comes to understanding, I think kind of everyone in the debate will kind of agree. I think you can't really get aesthetic understanding on the basis of testimony. I think where the controversy will come in is whether like some understanding is required for judgment to be legitimate. So I think that kind of some people like Hopkins, for example, might say, well, actually, in the aesthetic case, for whatever reason, I need understanding for my judgment to be legitimate. Whereas that's often what the optimists will deny. So the optimists will say, well, no, look, kind of aesthetic judgment is just like judgment about chairs and tables and whatever else. It's something where, look, the standard is knowledge or reasonable belief, whatever it is. It's the same standard as everywhere else. Whereas often now the pessimists will say, no, there's some different standard for aesthetics or from ethics that's kind of different for whatever reason. I mean, not all pessimists, some pessimists might still try and say, well, no, we don't have knowledge for this reason. But I think a lot of pessimists will now say, well, no, it's not really like knowledge as such, it's rather there's something extra required in the moral case, extra required in the aesthetic case for proper judgment. And whatever that is, we don't have that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I wonder if you could say more about the overgeneralization problem that you discussed after the Green Book case, right? So you talked about Green Book, and then you gave the example Green Book doesn't represent the lived experience of Black people in the United States. And you say, yeah, that seems true. That seems like something that you should be able to take on the say-so of somebody who does have that lived experience. It's depending on what we consider the bounds of aesthetic judgment. It's maybe not yet an aesthetic judgment. It seems like a correct representation, which could be orthogonal. And then it seemed like the overgeneralization problem came up when we moved to the question of Green Book is a bad movie. And I'm not sure I followed it. This isn't a veiled criticism. I really didn't follow it.
Yeah, so I guess, something I'm trying to think about a bit myself, but it seems like there's certain things I think a pessimist was going to allow us to defer to, and those things do seem the kind of things that would make a difference to artwork being kind of good or bad in general. So think about kind of, I'm making like a photorealistic portrait of you and it looks nothing like you. Then that looks like something, well, the claim this kind of painting looks nothing like you seems like something it seems fine to defer about because that's not a self-aesthetic claim. So the pessimist will say, look, it's fine to defer and say, well, look, this kind of, this painting of you has like 3 eyes and is like 2 foot short or whatever else. This kind of painting looks nothing like you. And just seem like, well, look, I'm trying to do like a photorealistic painting. That seems like a bad thing about that painting. So I think it's interesting where the pessimist is going to try and like stop things there, because it feels like, well, they're kind of going to, on the one hand, going to allow, I can defer about painting not looking like someone. I can defer about something not being accurate to experience or not accurate to how things were historically. And yeah, I guess it's all like they need to think about somewhere, I guess, to block the further move to the aesthetic claim. That somehow I can defer about the first thing, but can't defer about the further aesthetic claim. And yeah, so it feels like they need to have some general thing to say there. I'm not quite sure what that would be, so it's a bit tricky, because again, in a way that's their problem, I'm not them. So it feels like, I think certainly it does look like you have something like Rob Hopkins' view, and I think one problem with Rob Hopkins' view, he has these kind of non-epistemic norms on belief. And it seems kind of, in some ways, kind of there's certain kinds of inferences you have to not make in order to have that kind of view. So say, look, well, I've watched this film and I met the standards for knowing the film is kind of good. No, sorry, I've not watched it. So, no, I've not watched the film. So you've watched the film, you testified to me that the film is kind of good. I think, well, look, this testimony is really reliable. I've met all the conditions for knowing the film is good, but I don't believe the film is good. I can't form a belief because that's illegitimate. I think that does seem like quite a kind of difficult position to have. I think I might get something similar here, where I say, look, well, I've kind of learned on the basis of testimony this film is kind of meant to be historically accurate, and I've learned on the basis of testimony the film is wildly historically inaccurate, but I'm not going to form the belief it's a bad film. That kind of, again, seems like hard inference to block, really, but yeah.
maybe, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, maybe this is the intersection between optimism, pessimism on the one hand, and reductionism, anti-reductionism on the other, because it seems to me that if you were broadly speaking reductionist about testimony, then there's a lot of room to say something like, we're all familiar with that experience of learning something about a piece of art that disrupts your ability to enjoy it.
Yes.
We're learning something about a piece of art that informs your ability to enjoy it. And I've got lots of experience with Maria of her getting it right.
Yeah.
She tells me things about works of art that I thought were good, and then afterward I'm like, that's shit. Or there's something that I just didn't see the point of, and then Maria says, but did you realize that? And then I'm like, that is amazing. And so on the basis of that, here's this piece of art, I haven't seen it yet. Maria tells me it's great. I've got great, and now, so if you're an anti-reductionist, you might say, that's the wrong kind of basis, because it's this Humean kind of, you've got reliable, other reasons are creeping in, blah, blah, blah. But unless you're an anti-reductionist, there's nothing stopping you from saying, I'm just going to take Maria's word for it. And I think we all have trusted interlocutors like this, especially on the moral case, right? People who will message you and say, I got an invitation to a conference by the Heterodox Academy. Do I want to do this? No, you do not. Right? And all that means is, I know reasons that I could explain to you that I think you would find compelling. I'm not going to explain it to you. I know you trust me, right? So maybe that's what's going on with the question of whether there is or isn't overgeneralization, is that there is in the background a reductionist, anti-reductionist distinction. Does that sound?
Yes, I mean, I've not really had a chance to think about that, but that's certainly something that might well be plausible, So I think it's interesting because I think in kind of a paper like Nick Zangle talked a bit about testimony and kind of cases where you sort of form beliefs on the basis of someone being very unreliable. So basically, it says like someone who, like a critic who thinks his opinion is always wrong. So like if the critic says that's kind of the film's great, like this assumes it's terrible, and vice versa. And again, I think kind of on a kind of like inductive thing, that seems as good as the case where you form the belief it's good because of reliability say it's good, or bad because reliability it's bad. It's like kind of kind of in a way like inductively, if you're kind of counter reliable, you can use that just as well as like kind of reliable case. Whereas another model of testimony that would be kind of harder to use because or at least wouldn't be testimonial warrant or something. But good question. I'll think about that because I'm not quite. But these are just implausible. I think another thing that I kind of was thinking about mentioning is just I think a lot of the kind of case of testimony focus on what's good. I think that can often kind of make things seem kind of perhaps harder for the optimist because it feels like just there's various things like you might think, well, just the fact that the film's quite accurate doesn't make it good. So like I'm trying to make a film and I'm trying to make the film quite accurate. If I succeed, that doesn't necessarily make it good. Whereas but then the reverse does seem to hold. Where like if I'm trying to make a story accurate film and it fails to be story accurate at all, that just makes it a bad film. So I feel like kind of getting to like it being a bad film on the basis of particular aesthetic features seems a lot easier than getting to be a good film on the basis of particular aesthetic features. So there's an asymmetry there. And again, I think something that is kind of perhaps again I think that. One of the reasons why I've argued I think pessimism often seems convincing is it tends to focus on quite a narrow range of kind of cases. So you've got some like particular current artwork that kind of there's debate about whether it's good or not, and someone tells you it's good, do you believe them or not? Often that kind of thing kind of happens. I think those kind of cases are the ones that pessimism seems the kind of most plausible or something. Whereas if kind of like some like landscape where everyone else says amazing and wonderful and beautiful. And I say, well, I don't know, I've never been there and stuff. That just kind of seems like being a bit of a jerk, really. I mean, like, come on, everyone else thinks it's lovely, you're not kind of, particularly weird, or like you've not got some amazing insight into landscapes that people lack, so just defer to them. So I think that perhaps, one reason why pessimism might seem kind of plausible is it kind of focuses on quite a narrow range of cases. And I think you're right, there might be some differences about like how testimony works or why testimony works in the background there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So, just to make things a little more difficult. So, there's a distinction that some people make coming from language, talking about aesthetic expressions, but also kind of like move judgments and whatever. Between, there are many names for it. So, in a recent paper about Leonora Orlando and Angelo Caso, they talk about thick aesthetic terms, so it makes a difference between what they call experiential terms, and then like, the others are theoretical, I guess. And they seem to have kind of different profiles, right? One experiential is like when you have this. So beautiful will be one of the experiential ones, right? You just have this like direct psychological kind of driven judgment when you see something. And then the others are, well, you know, you have to know what Cubist needs to really appreciate this piece of piece of art. And so, I don't know, I mean, maybe, I'm sure you thought of this more than I did, but like, you know, testimony seems to maybe have different profiles depending on these types of expressions, because for the ones that are theoretical, of course, testimony should play a better role, should be more acceptable, and then the pessimist is not so entrenched in it.
Yes.
Whereas with the others, it seems like, I mean, whatever you do, and whatever you say, you're not going to convince me that this thing that I haven't experienced yet, or whatever, it's not going to be beautiful for me, or will be beautiful for me. So, yeah, I'm wondering if this creates some more complexity.
Yeah, good. So definitely are kind of cases like that. I think that, I mean, going back to the example before about the kind of film, we say, well, actually, look, you know, the film turns out to be unified if you kind of read the Carroll paper and understand why it's unified. But if you just like say, like, you know, hey, look, what do you think about the shade of blue? And you say, oh, I don't like it. You know, let me explain to you how it's just a nice shade of blue. Like, look at it, it's really pretty. Like, I'm not going to convince you the shade of blue is nice by talking at you for like any amount of time. So I think that's definitely right. And I mentioned before I'm using kind of quite a wide range of like aesthetic properties. I think that's something that's kind of needed for this kind of case, just because I think we're talking about things like kind of racism, sexism and stuff. That definitely seems like not the sort of straightforward experiential kind of property. That seems more like the one that needs the kind of background knowledge. I think certainly some pessimists are just pessimists about the kind of quite narrow range. And I think they'd be kind of fine with kind of cases and say, yep, sure, defer about the film being bad or whatever, I don't care about that. I kind of, you know, my thing is being like pessimistic about deferring to claims about beauty or gracefulness or gaudiness or whatever else. So I think that kind of pessimist would be kind of, you know, wouldn't have any problem with all that stuff said. Here wouldn't be an exception to their view at all. It would just be, you know, they're happy to allow you can defer about what's a masterpiece, what's a bad film, what's unified, what's whatever else. The other pessimists definitely want to kind of go pessimistic, really kind of like, you know, all over the place. So like anything that's like an evaluation of an artwork pretty much as an artwork, you know, including like originality, including good artwork, bad artwork, all that stuff they're really pessimist about, all of that, yeah. So I think there are different kind of pessimists there. Some are pessimists just about the narrow kind of property, experiential properties. Some are pessimists about a much wider range of things.
Okay. And one the Maori case and the Rap case, they seem like, you know, that they're kind of more theoretical kind of stuff. So really,
yes.
I mean, I can find a face ugly or whatever, but like if I want to appreciate that, I need to know that.
Yeah. Yes. So the Maori case is interesting because it does feel like, I mean, I guess my thought is kind of Kant seems to be thinking like it's bad for like theoretical reasons. So he's decided you shouldn't kind of decorate human beings a certain way. So like, you know, I will not find that beautiful because that's like a bad thing to do to human beings for like weird Kant reasons. Yeah. So I think certainly kind of complicated just was like Kant just like in some sort of entirely detached way just looked at them and went, I don't like that. But yeah, I feel like more again he's got some like whole big framework. It's, you know, his framework's decided that's bad. So like it doesn't matter what they look like. They're not going to be beautiful because they kind of don't match that. Yeah.
Do we have time? So thinking about this distinction that Dan is talking about between sort of knowing theoretically maybe that something is beautiful on the strength of somebody's testimony versus feeling it beautiful for me. I wonder if when you think about one of the functions of testimony, at least as epistemologists of testimony tend to construct it, is its reassertability, right? So accepting testimony is supposed to give you a license to pass it on.
Yeah.
So suppose somebody says to me, oh, Seinfeld is very funny. And I say, I've never found it funny.
Yeah.
And we have a conversation and it turns out that there's this thing called cringe humor. And I just don't get it. I find it cruel, but other people find it funny. But, you know, I'm open-minded. I say, okay, there's this thing that's kind of invisible to me. I don't find it funny, but I accept that it is a thing. There's cringe humor. People who like cringe humor find this very funny. You, sir, I take your word for it. Thank you very much, sir. Yes, Seinfeld is cringe funny. It seems to me that if I then turn around and say to the English, oh, Seinfeld is so funny, That doesn't feel right.
Yes.
Right? It feels like I can only reassert that testimony by inserting a hedge, right?
Yeah.
That I'm really only licensed to say, I'm told by some people that Seinfeld is funny, even though it doesn't make me laugh. Or I don't find it funny. Do you think this is a concern for the optimistic view, that even that it looks like there's this kind of incomplete, that there are cases where we want to say, yes, you're enfranchised to accept somebody's testimony, but you're not so enfranchised that you can then turn it and reassert it to somebody else?
Yeah. So I actually think that's the best objection to the optimist view. So like that's something where yes, I can't actually go into that too much because basically I've got like a very long pragmatic explanation of what I think is going on there. So I think it's something where I think the assertions are problematic for like pragmatic reasons. Because I think there's some kind of strange implicature stuff that arises in the aesthetic case isn't in other cases. But yeah, so I've got kind of paper to talk about that length. I kind of I probably can't give like a sort of summary in about 2 minutes. It's going to be very convincing. But basically, my thought is I think there's pragmatic reasons to take those cases to be problematic, even if the police themselves are fine. So yeah, that's the kind of general view I have here.
It is only a clarificatory question related to the concept of moral operation. Can you relate that concept with another similar concept that is the epistemic injustice? It seems that there is a similarity between operation and epistemic injustice, and according to epistemic injustice is always understood as a form of testimony and so on. That is the first question. The second question is related with that, and we can ask the following: Can we also apply operation to the aesthetic domain, the concept of operation or epistemic injustice to epistemic domain? Suppose that we live in a totalitarianism regime that control art. In that case, it seems that we have operation in art or aesthetic domain. So, we can have the analogy again between the moral testimony and the aesthetic testimony, because in the both we can have operation or epistemic injustice or something like similar.
Yeah, great, thanks. So on the first point, I definitely think there's going to be lots of issues about epistemic injustice here. So I mean, again, I think perhaps not just epistemic, there might be other kinds of injustice going on as well, but certainly I think quite a lot of injustice happening in the kind of more cases are going to be epistemic injustice cases. So kind of Fricker talks about hermeneutical injustice, for example, kind of like, and that might be kind of part of the reason why Peter can't understand the relevant sexism kind of concepts. He doesn't have the right kind of resources to understand what's going on because they're not widely shared, those things like that. Also, again, I think the fact that certain people's testimony is devalued, and in various ways that can, of course, be a big issue in both cases. So I feel like traditionally these people like Kant, at least again, in Europe, these people like Kant are given like a lot more weight than the views of indigenous Maori people about their own tattooing practice and stuff. So definitely think, in both cases, lots of epistemic injustice, both testimonial and hermeneutic going on. I think in both cases, again, it's the question about, well, what kind of like extra duties does that kind of give us, if any? So I guess the kind of one version is just, well, we were wrong because these epistemic mistakes we made and the wrong people. So what we ought to do is just like correct the norm where we would have made any other epistemic mistake, and do some apologising for the wrong people, but like in terms of our judgment, just do the same thing we would in any other case. I think other people suggest that actually there's some extra reason to kind of correct or extra reason to defer now because of the injustice. So not just because of the being wrong in sort of factual sense, but like the injustice itself creates some extra reason to defer. I think that's going to be kind of the more controversial element. The second point, I'm blanking on what's the second point again?
Concept related with suppose that we have
Oh yes, so yes, yeah.
regime that control art, that make operation.
Yes. Yes.
What the artist can do.
Yes.
In that case, it seems that we have an epistemic injustice
Yes.
applied to.
That's right. Yes.
So the analogy, we can hope that there is an analogy.
Yes. Yes. So certainly, I think kind of oppression can be a relevant thing in aesthetics in general. So various ways in which oppression can make a big difference to how people evaluate artworks, which people do the evaluating, which artworks get evaluated at all, which ones get evaluated positively and negatively. So I think even in kind of actual sort of situations without totalitarian regimes in kind of quite sort of liberal democratic countries, still various ways in which people from certain groups get their work kind of ignored or denigrated more than other people because of their social positions. Yes, I think definitely the fact that kind of the oppression stuff carries over, I think is definitely right. I think the concern is again how much deference should carry over and what it would look like, I think is more the issue I was kind of struggling with. Thanks.
Yeah.
Questions? We're thinking here about Kant's very distinction between what we call aesthetic judgments.
Yes.
Is a subcase of what it's actually precisely what Kant called taste judgments. So, and what's an aesthetic judgment, which is the larger class?
Yes.
It's a judgment made on the basis of a response.
Yes.
Economic response.
Yeah.
So, pleasure, displeasure.
Yes.
But what distinguishes those that are the agreeableness judgments from genuine taste judgments, normativity expectation. So there's an element of there's an expectation that others will agree with me.
Yes.
So this is the difference because there's not going to be this discussion about it, at least according to Kant.
Yeah.
I like Madeira wine over Porto wine or
Yes.
whatever. What we just called the judgments made with substantive, like the difference between predictive, if you want to experiential,
Yes.
or with thick concepts,
Yes.
substantive judgments. These would probably fall into what Kant would call dependent beauty, or better, stuff that would go into a judgment of dependent beauty. For instance, why am I saying this? Okay, the movie is what is highly unified. And
Yes.
When you say it like that, it seems like a reason for why it is beautiful because it has this feature. It's highly unified. Highly unified could also be another way of saying it's boring.
Yes.
And so it depends on how the substantive qualities combine with other substantive
Yes.
qualities. So we are really what I'm trying to go with this is the difference. What distinguishes the aesthetic judgment is the normativity. Should I find this? Should I have this response to it? Should I or should I modify my response? So, and also in connection to this, the option between reductionist and non-reductionist about testimony seems to coincide with whether you're reductionist, non-reductionist, about the aesthetic itself. Do we have a reason to separate aesthetic predicates, aesthetic judgments from other judgments? Do we really have a substantive reason for that?
Yes.
So, okay, this makes sense.
Yes, great, yes, thanks. That's definitely something where I think a lot of that does kind of like tie with quite big debates in the field. So I think typically, a lot of people like me, a lot of activists will think, well, when it comes to judgment in the sense that we're talking about here, the difference is just basically like content. So like, I think aesthetic judgments just differ from judgments about kind of tables, chairs, plants, etc. just because they're about something different. So I think that typically the assertions we make about aesthetics like map onto those kind of judgments rather than the kind of thing Kant talks about. The kind of thing Kant talks about does exist. I think that's something that's kind of certainly we do have experiences, pleasurable experiences, certain times of demand, agreement, perhaps that kind of thing. But I think that my thought is, again, when it comes to what the mental correlate of aesthetic assertions is, I think it's something that's like beliefs basically. It's not that kind of experience. Whereas I think people like Gordievsky and Marcus, for example, they kind of think, well, they agree with me they're both like that kind of experiences and beliefs, but they think the term aesthetic judgment should kind of like fit with that kind of experience rather than fitting with beliefs. So I think a lot of debate is basically what the kind of mental correlate of our like typical assertions of aesthetics is. And a lot of times optimists will think it's something like beliefs, a lot of pessimists will think it's something different. Think the kind of mental correlate is some kind of experience or some kind of whatever else. certainly not all pessimists, or some pessimists, Rob Hopkins, for example, do think their beliefs, I think there's some special reason not to form those beliefs. But a lot of times, like other people who are pessimists will say, well, actually, kind of the mental correlate of my assertion about tables and chairs, whatever else, is a belief. The mental correlate of my assertion about aesthetics is a kind of Kantian experience of pleasure or some other thing like that. Yeah, so I think that's definitely kind of, a lot of kind of the pessimist-optimist debate, I think, does turn about on that debate about, well, what actually is an aesthetic judgment? So I think certainly most people will agree they can have beliefs about aesthetic things, and will agree you can have like those kind of experiences. I think a lot of debate will actually turn on, well, what's the thing we're talking about most of the time when we talk about aesthetics? Is it in some sense we're expressing our beliefs, or is it expressing some other pleasurable state or something else like that? I kind of go with the first thing. I think a lot of other people go with the kind of second thing.
Well, thank you.
Great, thanks.